I was 80 years old when I finally found the letter, folded into eighths and gone soft as cloth at the creases, tucked behind the lining of a cedar chest that had sat at the foot of my bed for 6 decades without me ever thinking to check beneath its floor. My hands shook opening it, not from age, though age had made them shake plenty on their own by then, but from the particular tremor that comes when you understand, all at once, that you are about to learn something your whole life would have been different for knowing. The paper smelled like cedar and something underneath the cedar, something like dust and lamp oil and a kitchen I had never stood in. I sat down on the edge of the chest itself because my legs would not hold me standing, and I read my grandmother's handwriting for the first time in a voice that was not the voice she had used with me. Mennonite was the only thing I had ever known her to be. That was simply a fact of her. The way her hands were always dry from flour and her prayer covering was smaller and plainer than the Amish ones I had seen at market as a girl, pinned back with a kind of quiet confidence that never once wavered in front of me. An old sedan the color of a robin's egg carried her everywhere by the time I was born, and I remember riding in the back seat with my knees against the vinyl, watching telephone poles go by and thinking nothing of it, because to me that was simply what grandmothers did. A radio sat in her kitchen and played hymns on Sunday mornings, and sometimes, when she thought no one was listening, something with a fiddle in it that made her foot tap under the table. I never once heard her mention the word Amish in 18 years of knowing her before she died. Not once. And there in that letter, in ink gone brown as tea, she had written to a sister I never knew existed about a barn raising, about a horse named for a hymn, about a bishop's decision that had split a family down its center like a log under an axe. If you have ever inherited a silence, a gap in a family story that nobody quite explains, a name that gets skipped over at the supper table, a photograph that is never taken down but also never spoken of, I think you already know the particular ache of what I felt sitting there. It is not quite grief, because you cannot grieve a thing you never had. It is closer to standing in a doorway you didn't know existed and feeling the cold air of a whole other house on your face, and understanding, in that same instant, that the house had been there the entire time, on the other side of a wall you'd always assumed was solid. Amish was the world she was raised in. That was the first sentence of the letter. Plain as that, no ceremony to it, the way the truest things are often said. A settlement 2 states from where I was born had shaped her childhood. A district so strict that even the shade of blue permitted in a dress was regulated by conversations among the elders that took hours, and her hair had been parted so severely down the center that she said, in her own words, decades later, to a sister she wrote to in secret, she sometimes felt the part itself was a kind of fence built right down the middle of her skull. Church rotated through a different farmhouse every other Sunday, the benches carried in on a black wagon that groaned under their weight. The smell of the wagon's iron wheels on gravel a sound she said she could still hear 40 years later whenever a truck passed slow on a road at dusk. Her father's hands, thick and cracked from fieldwork, folded themselves in prayer with a tenderness that never once showed itself anywhere else in his bearing. How strange, she wrote, that the gentlest thing about a hard man was the one gesture he performed with his eyes closed, when no one but God could see it. Small things surfaced too, in her account. The particular blue of a jar of buttons kept on a windowsill, the sound of her mother's treadle sewing machine going late into the evening by lamplight, the taste of a certain bread that she said she tried, unsuccessfully, for the rest of her life to recreate in a Mennonite oven that ran too hot and too even, missing whatever imperfection had made the original loaves taste the way they did. Isn't it strange, she asked on the page, how you don't understand a smell is home until you've spent 30 years failing to summon it back? I read that line twice, then a third time, because it seemed to me the truest sentence in the entire letter, and perhaps the truest sentence I had encountered in a very long while about what it means to lose a place you can never physically return to. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it matters more than it might seem. Have you ever loved a place or a way of living so completely that you didn't understand it was a choice at all? You only understood it as the shape of the world? Sit with that for a moment. I certainly am, 80 years old, sitting with a letter in a lap that has forgotten how to hold anything without trembling, understanding for the first time that my grandmother spent her whole adult life quietly grieving a bread she could not recreate, a windowsill she could not return to, a hand-parted line down the center of her own scalp that she must have felt, every single morning of her life, even after she stopped parting her hair that way at all. 19 was her age, the same age I was once, the same age so many of us were when the largest decisions of our lives arrived dressed as small ones, when a Mennonite family moved onto the neighboring farm, refugees in a sense from a stricter district somewhere north, seeking land and a gentler bishop. At a fence line one September morning, while she was pinning wash to a line that snapped taut in the wind, she first spoke to the young man who would become my grandfather. Mennonite was what he was. A truck the color of rust carried him around, even then, even in that plainer age, and he wore his hat differently, tipped back off his forehead in a way that unsettled her at first. She wrote, the way anything unfamiliar unsettles you before it becomes dear. His church permitted electric light in the barn, allowed telephones for emergencies, let its young people study past the 8th grade if the family could manage it. Small differences, she called them at first, and then, a few pages later in the same unsteady hand, she crossed that word out and wrote instead, they were not small at all. They were the whole shape of a different life, folded up small enough to fit through a fence gap so I would not notice its true size until I was already standing on the other side of it. Restraint marks her account of their courtship, and I found it almost unbearable to read, because I understood, even from a distance of decades and through her careful, guarded phrasing, how much feeling had been pressed flat beneath it. For the better part of a year they spoke across that fence before either of them said anything that could be called forward, because in both their worlds a woman's reputation was a fragile thing, easily bruised by rumor, and so their entire courtship existed largely in glances and in small kindnesses. A jar of preserves left wordlessly on a fence post, a hymn hummed just loud enough to carry across a field on a still evening, a decision to walk the long way to town so their paths might cross near the mill. Slowly and then all at once, she wrote, is how she fell in love with him, the way she imagined ice gives way on a pond, solid for so long you forget it can crack, and then gone entirely before you've even understood the sound. This is where I have to stop the story again and ask you to consider your own fence line, that place in your life, if you have one, where a version of you stood facing a door that looked ordinary and turned out to be the hinge on which everything swung. Have you had a moment like that? A person, a decision, an ordinary Tuesday that quietly became the day your life split into a before and an after? I would love to know, because I think we carry these moments more than we admit, tucked away like letters behind the lining of a chest, waiting patiently for someone, someday, to go looking. 21 is the age she married him, and in marrying him she left. Not dramatically, there was no shouting in her letter, no scene of slammed doors, and I have come to believe that most true partings in plain communities are quiet, are almost polite, are conducted in the same soft voices used for everything else, which somehow makes them harder rather than easier to bear. Her father did not forbid the marriage outright. Instead he simply stopped speaking to her directly at the supper table, addressing his sentences to her mother instead, as though my grandmother had already become a kind of ghost sitting in her old chair. That specific, surgical cruelty, being spoken about rather than to, by a man who loved her, in a kitchen she had scrubbed every Saturday of her childhood, was, in her own words, the loneliest sound she ever knew, quieter than any door slamming, and far longer in its echo. There is a particular grief, I think, that comes only from people who do not raise their voices. It moves in without knocking and it never quite leaves. Her last supper at that table as a daughter of the house rather than a guest went unmarked at the time, though she did not know it would be the last one. Her mother had made her favorite dish without being asked. Her father passed the bread without meeting her eyes. The whole meal proceeded with an ordinariness that felt, in retrospect, unbearable, because ordinary things are what you miss most fiercely once they've been taken from you. Nobody said the word goodbye, she wrote. Nobody needed to. The silence had already said it for us, days before I even packed the first of my things. If you're still with me, this is where I want to ask something of you directly, because this story, hers, and now somehow also mine, 80 years late, deserves more than a quiet watching and a quiet scrolling on. If any part of this has touched something true in you, some fence line of your own, I'd ask you to subscribe to this channel, not for me, but because there are so many women like her, women who crossed one plain world into another and carried the whole weight of it silently for the rest of their lives, and their stories deserve to be told before the last people who remember them are gone the way she is now gone from me, except through ink. Only briefly did she describe the wedding itself, a small gathering, her mother present but her father not, a white cake her new mother-in-law had made because my grandmother's own mother could not bring herself to bake her daughter's wedding cake, an absence baked, quite literally, into the center of the celebration. A dress the Mennonite women had helped her sew, cut in a style slightly different from what she'd grown up wearing, is what she remembered wearing in front of a small mirror, a luxury of vanity she hadn't grown up with either, not recognizing the woman looking back at her, not because the dress was so very different, but because for the first time in her life no one had told her exactly how to stand in it. Moving from Amish to Mennonite life, I had always imagined, if I had imagined it at all, which I hadn't, because I hadn't known, would feel like loosening a belt one notch, a small relief, nothing more. But her account of the first months describes it instead as being asked to speak a language she had studied only from a distance, understanding every word yet fumbling the accent of it constantly, aware always of a half-second's delay between what the women around her did instinctively and what she had to consciously decide to do. Answering a telephone without her hand trembling on the receiver did not come easily at first, the machine itself feeling less like a convenience and more like a small quiet betrayal of everything her father's silence had meant. For a year she wore her covering differently, until someone gently, kindly, without unkindness, showed her the shape expected of her now, and she cried afterward not because the new shape was wrong but because it meant, finally and completely, that the old one was truly behind her. Church services themselves surface in another passage, how the singing ran faster in her new congregation, less drawn out, less mournful in its long unison tones, and how for months she found herself half a beat behind everyone else, her mouth still shaping the old slow syllables while the room around her had already moved on to the next line. Nobody corrected her. That was its own kind of loneliness, she wrote, to be allowed your mistake in silence, out of kindness, and to understand from that very kindness how visibly foreign you still were. Can you imagine grieving upon it? I confess I could not, until I read those pages. But grief does not care what shape it takes. It settles into whatever is nearest, a hairpin, a hymn tune, the particular creak of a certain kind of wagon wheel, the too even heat of an unfamiliar oven, and it stays there quietly for the rest of a life, waiting to be noticed by someone, perhaps a granddaughter, 80 years old, sitting on the edge of a cedar chest with trembling hands, only now beginning to understand what she is holding. Every season for years, she wrote to that sister, the one who had stayed, who had remained Amish her whole life and raised her own large family within that same strict district, in letters smuggled, I gathered, through a cousin who moved between both worlds more easily than either sister could. Copies of these letters, or perhaps the originals returned to her after her sister's death, sit folded together in that same cedar chest, a whole conversation across the fence line that never fully closed, two women speaking two increasingly different dialects of the same original language, checking in on each other the way you check on a wound to see if it has healed crooked. Children, a new bishop stricter than the last, a controversy in the district over whether a certain kind of farm equipment could be permitted, small disputes that from the outside might look trivial and from the inside, I now understand, were the entire architecture of a life, filled her sister's half of the correspondence. My grandmother wrote back of her own children, including, eventually, my mother, and of learning to drive, finally, at 40, her hands gripping a wheel with the same white-knuckled devotion she'd once given to a horse's reins, as though the discipline of plain life did not disappear when the vehicle changed, only transferred itself into a new shape. One exchange in particular, tucked near the middle of the bundle, has stayed with me longest. The sister asks, plainly, without cruelty, but without softening it either, whether my grandmother regretted leaving. My grandmother's answer, half a page long, is the part of the letter I have now read so many times I could recite it without looking. She did not regret the man she married, she wrote, nor the children that followed, nor even, in the end, the different shape of faith she came to hold. What she regretted, deeply and permanently, was the particular way the leaving had to happen, that it could not be done gently, that there was no path in either world, at that time, for a daughter to become something else without becoming, in some quiet corner of her father's heart, a stranger. "I have made my peace with the choice," she wrote. "I have never made my peace with the cost of it landing so entirely on my father's silence rather than being shared between us. Gently, I have to ask you now, because this question sits at the center of everything I've told you tonight. Do you believe a person can change the shape of their faith, or their family's expectations, without betraying the heart of what they were raised to believe? I don't ask this to be answered quickly. I ask because my grandmother clearly wrestled with it every day of her adult life, in silence, at a kitchen table with a radio playing hymns low enough that a fiddle tune could slip in underneath without anyone quite noticing. Near the end of the letter sits a line I have read now perhaps 40 times, and I do not think I will ever stop turning it over. I did not leave the Amish because I stopped believing in a plain and humble life before God," she wrote. "I left because I found I could still believe in that life and hold it in a different shape than the one I was given, and for years I was ashamed to admit that this was possible, because it meant that the fence I had once thought was the whole world was, after all, only a fence." A visit back to her childhood district, many years later, closes that same passage, after her father had died and something in the silence between them had finally, too late, gone quiet in a different way. At the edge of the old farm, a woman now in her 50s, she stood watching a new generation of children run across a yard she once ran across herself, feeling two entirely true things at once, that she belonged there completely, in the marrow of her, and that she belonged there not at all, not anymore, not in any way the people currently living there would recognize. "Both were true," she wrote, "and I have stopped trying to resolve them into one feeling. Some doors you can stand in for the rest of your life without ever fully choosing a side of the frame." That image stays with me, my grandmother standing at the edge of a farm that was no longer hers, belonging and not belonging in the same breath, and I wonder how many of us carry a version of that doorway somewhere inside us, whether we've ever named it or not. None of this did she ever tell me. Not the fence line, not her father's silence, not the year she wore her covering slightly wrong out of grief rather than ignorance, not the visit back to the farm where she stood belonging and not belonging all at once. She died when I was 18, and in all those years, in all those Sunday dinners and long summer afternoons on her porch shelling peas into a metal bowl, she let me believe she had only ever been one thing, Mennonite, plain, unremarkable in the way grandmothers are meant to seem unremarkable to the young. I used to think this meant she had nothing to tell. Now I understand it meant the opposite. She had so much to tell that telling it might have unmade the careful, quiet peace she'd built for herself, brick by brick, decade by decade, inside a life she had chosen twice, once by leaving, and once, every single day afterward, by staying. Small gestures of hers come back to me differently now. Habits I misread my whole life as simply personality rather than as scars translated into routine. A jar of buttons sat on her own windowsill, just like the one from her childhood. Hymns at our own Mennonite church came out of her a half-beat slower than everyone else's, the way she must have hummed them for 60 years without anyone in her new life ever knowing why. A phone ringing too suddenly in a quiet room made her flinch, almost imperceptibly, every single time. I saw these things my whole life and understood none of them. Only now do I understand them, an old woman myself, holding the key that unlocks a woman I loved and never once actually knew. 80 years old myself now, older than she ever got to be, I sit at my own kitchen table with her letter open in front of me, and I understand something I could not have understood at any earlier age, that the people who raise us are never only what they show us. They are also every door they quietly closed so that we would never have to feel its draft. My grandmother carried a whole Amish childhood, an entire fence line, an entire sister and father and grief, folded into eights inside herself for 60 years, so that I could grow up in the sunlight of what looked like a simple, single, unbroken life. It was not unbroken. It was mended, beautifully, and I never once saw the seam until I was old enough, finally, to go looking for it. If this story has stirred something in you, a thought about your own grandmother, your own inherited silences, the fences in your own family history that you've never quite had the courage to ask about, I'd ask you gently to like this video, not for me, but because somewhere out there is another person carrying a similar unopened letter, a similar folded shape of grief they don't yet have words for. And this small gesture is how stories like hers find the people who need them. More than anything, I would love for you to tell me in the comments. Is there a silence in your own family you've never asked about? A grandmother, a father, an aunt, who lived a whole hidden chapter before you ever knew them? I read everyone, and I think somehow she would have wanted me to hear them too. Thank you for sitting with me and with her tonight. Wherever your own fence line is, I hope you find, someday, the gentleness to walk back and look at it clearly.